VR really immerses the player with different interactions and feedback that it provides through things like motion controllers and headset. Um, this isn't really seen in the UI that's created for a lot of VR games, and this is something that I wanted to change. This prototype was mainly aimed at providing a more immersive and interactive ability to put in input and display that input back to the user. This dial, which also has a push feature, was mainly created with the intention of having a simple integer input that the player could easily adjust as they feel needed and then simply push to input into the game. The core intention at first was to create multiple widgets with similar interaction feedbacks, but due to adjustments in the timeline with situations going on in the world right now, this was not as plausible, and instead I put more of my focus into making this dial have a lot more feedback and feel a lot better to the player. So the dial I went about prototyping was inspired off of this image I created here, which actually showed the intention of what the dial would be, is simply a dial with a push ability to set information. The dial's actual look was heavily inspired off of the simple aesthetic that I went for this dial, which is very minimal and just showing the information that the player's putting in, and very kind of bright colors, which with the reds and greens to kind of offset if it's an input or if it's not set yet. The core features of creating this dial would be that I would need to allow the player to grab the dial and rotate it seamlessly, as well as have a push feature that feels really good to push in and know that you've set this information in for the value that you're setting. I later, when prototyping this, added the panel, which allowed me to kind of see right off the bat if I was updating a setting or if it wasn't set yet. I feel like this also allowed the player to understand that when the dial was red, they needed to push it in order to set the value. And I provided a little bit of text feedback so that the player understood that's what they needed to do. I feel like this also showed the ability to send information to another UI widget that someone might be using in a game or another application from the dial, which was very helpful in also allowing to have that outside feedback to connect to it. So looking a little bit into what's exposed to the end user for this dial, we have some of the values here on the side that are exposed in editor. Rotation max is actually what the dial uses for whatever you want to have as your max rotation amount. The dial ticks up currently integers. The plan is to eventually make this work with different kind of floats and maybe different other values the player might want to use, but currently it does use only integers. So having this set to 10 will make it so that the max value that you can put in is 9, as it is exclusive. So this dial, I currently have it so that it goes up to 50. In my opinion, anything more than 50, the actual fine movements of the dial do feel a little bit off. Most likely, the future implementation of this would be to allow the player to increase this amount by making the dial have finer movements with how much you can turn your hand. Other values that are shown is minimum distance from dial. Minimum distance from dial is the minimum distance the hand needs to be from the dial in order to start pushing the dial in. This variable is pretty much set with how it feels. If someone creates a bigger dial, they might want to make this value a little bit bigger so that you have more ability to move with. And for a smaller dial, you might want to make it a little bit smaller to make it so that you have finer pressing on it. Push amount is the amount that you can have the dial sink in. So if someone wanted to elongate or shorten the dial, this allows them to adjust how much you're actually allowed to push this into an object. So for me, I currently have it set to 10, which is the distance I have it from the wall. So a full 10 amount would be the wall. Set amount for the X is how much you want the dial to go in for you to set the dial. So for example, if my push amount is 10, then the amount the dial will be set in is 3 from 10, so it would be 7. So this is pretty much how much it recesses in when you push it. And then the click amount is how much you have to go beyond your set value in order for it to bottom out. And when it bottoms out, that is when it changes its state. So similar with a dial, when you push on the top, you're going to have your pretty much feedback of this is where you're going to hit. And then when you push it in, you're going to hear a click. That's its bottom out. And then when you let go, it's going to go back a little bit to that set value. So let's quickly look at the core architecture for the dial. So the only notable thing for on begin play is that we're actually spawning the UI separately from the dial on start. This allows us to either adjust which UI is spawned, and this is what then is attached to the player's hand when they grab the dial. In blue here, we have the main rotate dial function. So this is when the player is actually holding onto the dial, it then calls its rotate. And we have similar function layout here to an on start, on stop, and on during rotate. Simpler functionality is set up for the push. So we have a in process of pushing, a start push, stop push, and the switching of click state, which is for setting between set and unset, as you can see when the dial turns red and green for the text that it has. And finally, we have our on begin and end overlap. This is what checks to see if the player's hand is currently pushing the dial, as well as setting which hand is currently closest to push the dial. We finally, on the side, have some UI updates. This is mainly done to adjust the color of the text when the player has it set or unset, as well as checking to see the value of the dial is set properly when the player is adjusting the value. And then there's some small update functions. These are mainly used for the lerp that we're using for when the dial is pushed in and out to make sure that the dial is correctly reset when the player is not currently interacting with it. Along the side here, you can see the slew of variables we have to monitor all of this. Very little of them actually set to public for the player to edit with. Many of them are used for initial setting values so that there's always a reference to what the player can go back to. This is in case anyone wanted to do anything with the dial being disappeared or the dial moving around on the scene to either adjust for different terrain or movement that it might be attached to. So let's jump into VR and see how the dial works. So as you can see here in VR, we have the push dial, and it has currently two states. So the state could be either unset, which is the red dial here, as you can see it says push to set, or the pushed in set state, which then sets the value to the panel at the top. Now, this dial can be unpushed in order to adjust it. As you can see here, we can set it and with some tick feedback in order for the player. Also, what you can't see is that as the tick feedback happens, there's some haptic feedback in the controller. Once you have a value that you want to set to, you can take the dial and push it in order to set it. The dial can also be adjusted from a set position by grabbing it and then adjusting that value and then pushed back in order to set the value. So as you can see over here, we have some scaled down versions of the dial than the one we were previously using over there. This one's about 3/4 the size and this one's about half. And this allows us to kind of see the different interactions you might have with something on a slightly smaller scale. So grabbing the medium dial here, you can see we can adjust it to set it to a number, and then we can push it in. The push in on some of the scaled dials can be a little bit more, and this can be adjusted through the variables that we were discussing with the set value into the wall. And then something like this on a small dial, we can grab, set it to a value that we prefer, and push it in. And as you can see, that one goes a lot more into the wall, but as it being a smaller dial, you normally probably have this set to have it a little bit farther up from the wall. So some things I kind of learned while exploring and creating this dial prototype was that, first of all, making VR interactions feel really good is very difficult. There's a lot of things that go into kind of how something feels when you kind of go in to grab it, as well as the feedback you receive, and as well as visually what's happening when you're interacting with an object. Especially with this dial, it was really hard to nail down kind of the push and rotate of a dial and make it feel not only comfortable for the player when they're doing it, but make it feel like they really are interacting with this object in the space. Another thing I found while creating this prototype is that providing as much feedback as you can to the player makes an object feel better and better in VR. Starting to add things like the tick sound when you're rotating the dial, or even the color change, or even just having it so that you can see the visual push when you're doing the dial, kind of adds a lot more to the object, makes it feel more alive, but also feels like the player has more control over what they're trying to do. This is partly why I added the panel to the dial, is kind of provide more of feedback on what the player is exactly doing at any given moment in time when their hand might be sometimes over the top of the dial's UI. And finally, I just explored a lot more of Unreal, a lot of the different things they have involving VR interactions and VR components, things like the motion source object, being able to actually adjust the different kinds of haptic feedback that you get through a controller and messing around with the curves to make something that feels really good. A lot of these things are something that I never really explored, even when I was working on other VR projects. So being able to actually dive into those in a VR setting was very interesting. So I'm really happy with this prototype I created. I would really like to explore more avenues inside VR and UI in the future. This being definitely a good launching point, and maybe creating this into something a little bit more complex and easy to use for a front-end user. As well as maybe exploring different ways that this can be used in the setting of VR, whether that is menus or whether it's actual gameplay mechanics. I'd love to see where this might go in the future. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.